was really pleased. In the lead up to the production, we had our chapel services tied in and told the story of Joseph. We kind of matched up the Bible reading with a song from the musical. And when we got to the show itself, it was simply joyous. The young people who performed it were clearly having the time of their lives. Their joy and happiness just radiated from the stage. And apologies, as I know me sharing this anecdote now is triggering the young people as they're watching this, because one of the great losses of COVID has been the inability to stage school productions, which are often such a highlight of a student's time at school. Joseph is a great story, and it's got such a timely message for us as we reflected on last week. We'll see again this week and in the weeks to come. Well, last week, Mark introduced us to Joseph. There was some good news. Joseph had this gift for interpreting dreams. There was some bad news. Being his father's favourite son made Joseph's brothers jealous, and so they conspired to kill him. Then there was some mixed news. They didn't kill Joseph, they just sold him off as a slave. So as we've heard, today's reading is really a case of things going from bad to worse. Joseph is sold as a slave and finishes up working for Potiphar. Now we learn that Potiphar's the captain of the guard, so he's got a pretty important job. He's protecting Pharaoh and keeping him safe. Potiphar therefore would have been really well trusted by Pharaoh, and to kind of ensure his loyalty, you can be assured that Pharaoh would have paid Potiphar really well. He would have been really well looked after. So in a case of bad news, slightly good news, bad news, you're sold as a slave. Slightly good news, you're a slave for a person who's pretty important. And I'll just read this passage again because I really like this bit of the story. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favour in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him an overseer of his house and over all he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate. That's such a wonderful phrase. Because of Joseph, Potiphar had no concern for anything but the food he ate. I don't know if you've ever had that experience of reading the Bible and thinking to yourself, you know, they could have improved this a little bit. One of the things as we read the Bible now as modern readers that we really wish perhaps the Bible had more of is descriptions of people. We know so much about what Jesus did and taught, but there's nothing in the Gospels that provide any description of what he looked like. We all suspect, of course, that Jesus would have been balding and didn't have much hair, but it would be great to have some further details about what he looked like. But the Bible doesn't provide any. Another frustrating thing about the Bible is that it often doesn't provide time frames. And this story of Joseph would really benefit from them. How long did Joseph have to work in Potiphar's house? We read that he rises up through the ranks and becomes an overseer. Did this take weeks, months, years? We simply don't know, as we're not told. So Joseph's fortunes seem to be gently on the rise. Sure, he's a slave, but he's making the most of a bad situation. He's earning the trust and respect of his master. But into this gently improving situation comes Potiphar's wife. And in verse 6, we do get one of those rare descriptions of someone in the Bible. We read, "Now Joseph was handsome and good looking." As I said earlier, I've had lots of experience sharing this story with young people, and this particular section of the story does get a little bit challenging when you're dealing with young people. It's sort of one of those stories where you need to preface it with one of those warning announcements, caution, adult themes. And I have to say I was very impressed with how Jess navigated so skillfully through this passage and sharing it with the children just before, because this passage does present a bit of a challenge when you're doing a children's talk. Potiphar's wife's request to Joseph is pretty blunt. Lie with me. Slaves were regarded as property, and they had no rights of their own. So in a sense, Joseph has absolutely no right to refuse her request. And it was quite acceptable in those days for a man to sleep with their female slaves. And the great sort of patriarchal figures of the Bible, Abraham and Jacob, do this, of course. But Joseph turns Potiphar's wife's request down on the grounds of his loyalty to Potiphar. And interestingly, you sort of, at one hand, you couldn't actually blame Joseph if he did actually accept this request. Joseph is as a single man, is in a bad situation, which is not his fault. He's been the victim of some really major injustices. Why not sleep with Potiphar's wife? Make the best of a bad situation. And it could have been advantageous to him. Well, Potiphar's wife won't be denied, and she keeps demanding that Joseph sleep with her. Joseph continues to rebuff her, and he finishes up for his trouble getting framed for attempted rape. Last week, Mark invited us to wear colourful jackets as we kicked off this, and perhaps we could have continued this theme this week by wearing an item of clothing that had been torn. Some translations of the Bible talk about the cloak being discarded, others talk about the cloak being torn. And we see once again in the story, an item of clothing is used against Joseph. Last week we read how his cloak was stained with animal blood and used as evidence to prove that he was dead. Now a torn cloak is used to accuse him of attempted rape. Well, Potiphar naturally sides with his wife, and so Joseph is thrown in jail. Things have gone from bad to worse. Notice that as a slave, Joseph is denied a right of reply. He's accused and he's not even given a chance to defend himself against this false accusation. It's interesting that as you read a bit about this passage, scholars have speculated that perhaps Potiphar did have some sneaking suspicion that Joseph wasn't in the wrong in this situation. While it seems really harsh to us as we read this that Joseph gets thrown in jail, especially for a crime that he didn't commit, the fact is that Potiphar could have had him executed for this particular crime. But he isn't executed. Perhaps in not executing Joseph, Potiphar is showing that he suspects that his wife might not be the completely innocent party she's making herself out to be. So Joseph now finds himself the innocent victim of yet another injustice. It wasn't good that Joseph was favoured by his dad, but it wasn't Joseph's fault, and he certainly didn't deserve to be killed or sold as a slave. Joseph has wanted to make the best of a bad situation as a slave, and then along comes Potiphar's wife, and now he finds himself in prison. I think it's always interesting how what's going on at the time in the wider world or in your own life impacts how you read the Bible. I've read this story numerous times, but reading it again in the past week in this difficult time that we find ourselves in at present, I was struck by something that I hadn't really appreciated before. This passage makes it really clear that God is with Joseph. It gets mentioned a number of times. It's evident to the people around Joseph that God is with him. And yet, even though we're strongly reminded that God is with Joseph, this doesn't stop bad things happening to Joseph. I came across this cartoon this week, and I'll just get Karen to bring it up for us now. Well, this cartoon obviously has a funny side to it. We've all been experiencing that delightful thing of what happens when you're in a meeting or an activity when someone's on mute. It does have a serious edge to it. We've all been struggling with a global pandemic that's gone on for more than 1.5 years. Bad things are happening every single day because of it. I know that when I do eventually get back to school to face-to-face teaching again, students are going to have heaps of questions about this. If God is real and he loves us, why did he allow this terrible event to happen? I think at the moment it's really easy for us to feel like God is on mute. Certainly if you're like me, you don't feel like God's voice is coming through loud and clear at present. But this part of the Joseph story reminds us that just because God is with us doesn't stop bad things happening. Some of you might know that a few weeks ago, one of the year 10 students in my school where I work was killed in a car accident. It was in every sense of the term a senseless tragedy. The student was walking his girlfriend home one Sunday afternoon when a car veered off the road and killed him. He was killed on his 16th birthday. It's already a really difficult time, and this tragedy made it incredibly difficult for my school community and for his family. You quickly realise that grief is made to be shared, to put your arms around someone, to comfort them, but COVID ensured that we couldn't even do that. How on earth can a grieving family work out which 10 people can attend the funeral? Well, at the school where I work, we have 2 chaplains. And the other chaplain at the school had taken this particular student on an overseas trip when he was in year 8. And he knew him pretty well. So he was asked to be the one to take the funeral service. So a bit unusually for me, often when there's times of grief, I'm involved in conducting the services and getting involved. And that busyness kind of helps you take the edge off your grief. But I sat, as everybody else did, watching a live stream of the funeral, watching these 10 people gather together. And I was joined online by over 1,200 people. And it was an incredibly tough funeral to watch. And I was really feeling for my colleague, knowing that he had to bring words of comfort in this really difficult time. And I wondered beforehand, thinking what he might say. Tricky to say what words of comfort in this situation. He acknowledged the senselessness and the tragedy of the event. He said that we all wanted to know why this had happened, and this event defied easy answers. He then went on to say that the Christian response to this tragedy could be summed up in one word. And then he paused. And I was at home thinking, I wonder what this one word was going to be. I couldn't actually think of what he was going to say. And then he said what he thought the one word was that would bring comfort in this situation. Emmanuel, God is with us. So in the midst of grief and tragedy, we are assured that God is with us. He is not remote and distant. We might not be able to throw our arms around each other, but God is gently enfolding us with his arms of love. While it might not feel that way, we are not on our own. Joseph wasn't on his own. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was with him. At this point of the story, perhaps Joseph couldn't see it, but eventually he would. This is one of the great mysteries of faith. Having God with us doesn't mean that we won't ever find ourselves in a difficult place. But when we are in a difficult place, we can know that God is with us. And we can draw strength from that knowledge, just as Joseph did. I was 7 when Star Wars came out, and it changed my world. As an impressionable young boy, I fell in love with this particular film. I ate Weet-Bix every morning at breakfast in order to collect the Star Wars posters. I collected the Star Wars minifigures. They're not dolls, Mum, they're minifigures. When I heard there was going to be a sequel, I couldn't wait to see it. The Empire Strikes Back. And seeing it really blew me away. But I can also remember to this day how profoundly distraught I was when the movie ended. Luke had lost his hand, Darth Vader was claiming to be his father, and Han Solo was frozen in carbonate. The story can't end like this. Couldn't believe it when the credits rolled. No, this is not how it ends. At that stage, I didn't know, of course, there was going to be a third film. I had to sit for a couple of years in a pretty difficult place with my childhood heroes in peril. We read this passage knowing how the story ends. We know that things are going to get better for Joseph, and God is going to use all this hardship that he's going through in an amazing way. But imagine being Joseph, sitting in his cell. This is Good Friday, not knowing that Easter Sunday is coming. This is perhaps where we find ourselves right now. After all the sacrifices we have made, after all we have gone through, COVID seems to be yet again running out of control. If I'd told you a year ago, in the midst of that really tough lockdown that we endured, that a year on we'd be back in another really tough lockdown, we would have all despaired. So without wanting to press the fast forward button and get to the good stuff, let's sit in this difficult place and see what we can learn. One of the themes of the story of Joseph is one of resilience. How Joseph keeps bouncing back from the adversity that he faces. Joseph is sold off as a slave. What's Joseph's response? God is with me, so how can I be the best slave I can be? Joseph works hard to make the best of a very bad situation. Knowing that God was with him gave him the strength to bounce back. Resilience, as we all know, is a bit of a buzzword. At the school where I work, it's one of our 7 school values. In the last 18 months, it's moved from being one of those values we see on our values posters, which are in every classroom in our school, to being the lived reality of our school life. As students and staff have found ourselves in a pretty challenging time. COVID has knocked us all down. What is giving us the strength to bounce back? Building on this idea of resilience, you might have heard of this phrase, resilient discipleship, which is also a bit of a buzz phrase at present. How do you help people to follow Jesus for the long haul? The reality of the world that we live in is that if you want to follow Jesus, serious obstacles are going to be put in your way. If you want to follow Christ, you're going to get knocked down. What is going to give you the strength to get back up again? The passage today really emphasises how on his own Joseph is. He doesn't really have anyone on his side to draw on. He's been rejected by his brothers. He's on his own in a foreign land. Joseph draws on God to help him. Because God is with him, Joseph possesses this sort of inner strength that is clearly evident to those around him. Potiphar can see it, and it gives him the confidence to entrust the running of his entire household to Joseph. And this inner confidence enables Joseph to win people over. And this is a theme that we'll see again in this story. When you're talking about resilience, often resilience is described a bit like this idea of an invisible bungee cord that when you sort of fall, it enables you to bounce back. But there's another image of bouncing back that I quite like. I don't know if you've ever seen footage or photos of Eskimos doing a blanket toss. Eskimos have these really large blankets which are often made of seal or buffalo hide. And one of the activities they do is, as a fun thing with their children, is to all form a big circle to pick up the sealskin blanket, to put a child in the middle, and to then toss the child into the air. And it's amazing how high they can go. And then, of course, they catch them again, and then they throw them up in the air again. The person in the blanket is able to bounce back because they're drawing on the strength of all those around them. We have the benefit of a community of believers to enable us to bounce back when life knocks us down. Joseph didn't have this. I don't know how many times this year I've been comforted by a kind word or comment from someone at church through perhaps a breakout group or just an email that's been sent. I've learned to draw on the strength of others to help me bounce back when I get knocked down. One of the highlights of my year normally is, as a school chaplain, is attending the annual Anglican Schools Conference. One of the challenges of school chaplaincy is that you can often feel on the margins. You're on the margins in your school and you can be in the margins in the diocese. But when you go to the Anglican Schools Conference, you're surrounded by like-minded people who kind of get what you're doing and get your ministry. Every year the conference is hosted by a different state, and as part of the conference proceedings we gather in the particular cathedral for that city and we have a service. Well, this year the conference was due to be held in Melbourne, but because of COVID, of course, it had to be held online, and that meant the cathedral service had to be held online as well. I tuned into the conference from home and my expectations beforehand were really low. How do you feel a sense of genuine community online? How could a cathedral service work online and give us a sense of drawing closer to God? Much to my surprise, the conference did create a sense of community, even though we weren't able to gather together in person. And the virtual cathedral service closed with a version of The Blessing. You will probably be familiar with this song because it's become a bit of a pandemic anthem for the church. Each Anglican school in Victoria was asked to supply some students to sing this, and then it was edited together. As I watched this at the end of the service, I found myself getting a bit teary. At first, I felt really sad because I was reminded that the students were filming this in their homes in isolation. I was really powerfully reminded of all that they've lost in this formative years of their lives. A third of their secondary education has now been impacted by COVID. But as it went on, my sense of sadness gave way to a sense of hope, as through technology, these isolated students were brought together to form a choir, raising their voices and passionately singing about how, despite all that's going on, God is with them. So let me finish by handing over to the students in our Anglican schools, and I hope you will find this as comforting and as inspiring as I did.